One of the first monumental temples built in antiquity still rises majestically from the desert floor in southern Iraq. This remarkable temple tower is the best preserved example of what was once a plentiful and magnificent form of ancient architecture, the ziggurat. What exactly is a ziggurat? They were essentially staged temple towers, the type of structure most characteristic of worship in Mesopotamia. Ziggurats differ from the pyramids in Egypt in significant ways, such as accessibility and use. But in other ways, they resemble the soaring structures created in many ancient societies in appearance and function. Ancient people reached for the sky, which was recognized as the domain of the deities. Man, in reality, has always sought to breach the gap between the human and the divine. Mesopotamia was one of the first places to create such grand and monumental architecture devoted to the gods and to worship. In many respects, ziggurats and other types of pyramids, from Egypt to Mexico, are really artificial, man-made mountains with sacred meanings. So now we will go back to the site we have been examining, Ur, and see the most famous architectural monument of the Sumerians. Sir Leonard Woolley first arrived at the long-abandoned southern Mesopotamian city of Ur in 1922. He had no idea that fate would favor him with some of the most spectacular archaeological finds ever. The ruins at Ur were known to hold promising mounds ripe for excavation, but no one knew exactly what riches they held. They'd been recorded by the Europeans as early as 17th century and excavated in a very preliminary fashion. They actually appeared in a publication of 1857 in a sort of romantic, exotic, oriental scene. The excavations Woolley conducted at Ur for the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum made him famous. He is most remembered for the enormously rich royal cemetery at Ur, which we looked at in these last two lectures. But when Woolley began his work at Ur, he did not immediately begin excavating those amazingly rich burials. Why? He didn't know about them. He actually started by digging trial trenches within the enclosure that surrounded the remains of what was clearly ancient architecture. He thus began excavations near to the most obvious ruins at the site, the great ziggurat of Ur. In the second season of his work, 1923 to 24, he cleared the great mound of the ziggurat. Woolley was an experienced archaeologist and had already excavated the Syrian ruins of Carchemish with his colleague T.E. Lawrence, later better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence gained fame through his efforts to liberate modern-day Arabs from their colonial rulers. But it was Woolley who imaginatively reconstructed the Sumerian culture that was born on this alluvial plain of southern Iraq. The ruins of a ziggurat, or temple tower, loom over all else at Ur, dominating the landscape. We know that urban societies first began here in southern Mesopotamia, most likely, near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates River. This area, called the cradle of civilization, or by the Greeks, the land between two rivers, was often arid, with unpredictable rainfall in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. But it was not the desert it is today. In fact, the very important and wealthy city of Ur sprang up on the banks of the Euphrates River several centuries after the city of Uruk rose to importance. Back then, Ur was located near the Persian Gulf in a prime spot for trade. Goods from far away arrived at the port from India, Afghanistan, and countries all along the coastline. But things changed. The area around Ur is now an arid, desolate plain and nowhere near the river. The Euphrates changed its course over 2,000 years ago, away from Ur. But with a little imagination, we can conjure up the sort of town it might have been. The towns that developed into cities in southern Mesopotamia in the early 3rd millennium BC belonged to the Sumerians. They were a somewhat mysterious people who spoke a language that has no known relatives. It's thought that Sumerians probably developed the world's first writing, first cities, first schools, and the first temple bureaucracies. All these developments, leading into what archaeologists call complex societies, were possible because of people's ability to provide surplus food. The surplus seems to have come about with the development of irrigation agriculture. That and other soil technologies enhanced production of barley, wheat, and other foodstuffs. The economies of such cities and eventually empires were essentially quite different from what we have today. In fact, each Sumerian city-state was organized around the worship of a particular deity. You could even say that each Sumerian deity in the pantheon owned his or her particular city. They were the patron deities of the city and the ruler. Plenty of other deities were also worshipped, particularly those who held sway over natural forces like the sky, water, fertility, and weather. Rulers had both practical and religious roles. In the past, the Sumerian style of government has been called a theocratic state because the temple of the primary god and the temple's bureaucracy was a wealthy entity which controlled the land, the flocks, and other goods. Offerings were made to the deities in that temple complex. Wealth and goods could be redistributed by the temple's personnel. In fact, the system of government and religion was quite complex and nuanced according to town and time. This ziggurat at Ur, in fact, was just one part of a much larger temple complex. Most of its buildings, unfortunately, long vanished in the sand. It was in the center of the town and at the center of its daily life. Now, this is quite unlike the Egyptian funerary pyramids, which were remote from ordinary dwellings and situated or oriented towards the west. The city of Ur was devoted to the moon god, Nana, also known as Sin or Nana Suin, and it is to this god that the ziggurat at Ur is dedicated. Nana was the patron deity of the city. As the fortunes of the city grew, the god's importance did too. You could even say that Sumerians believed that this temple tower was the residence of Nana, at least part of the time. So who was Nana or Sin? He was the male Sumerian moon god. The sun god was also male. He was the son of the important god Enlil, the great mountain, and Ninlil, a young goddess whom Enlil raped and who, according to one Sumerian literary account, a poem, then became his wife. The moon was, of course, a significant beacon in a world without electric light and clocks, and it provided a means of counting time in the year. A lunar month was approximately 30 days long. Hence, Nana was associated with the number 30. Interestingly, the priestess of Nana, usually the daughter of a king, became a very important and powerful person in the history of Sumer and this city. We actually know the name of one of the priestesses, Enheduanna. She was the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad and the earliest author we know by name. She was a poet who wrote poetry to the moon. In the moon-shaped disk of Enheduanna, she is shown approaching a ziggurat in a ritual. Now, this particular ziggurat at Ur is the best preserved surviving example of what was once a flourishing building form. Once upon a time, every Sumerian city had a ziggurat. The famous Tower of Babel we know from the Bible is actually the ziggurat in Babylon from a much later time than this one at Ur. Here we can see that Peter Bruegel's imagination rebuilt the famous Babylonian tower in his painting from the 1500s. But he had no conception of what one actually looked like. So he probably used the Roman Colosseum as his model or something like that. As you can see, the tower is a circular construction rather than rectangular, and its arches are a Roman invention, not a form used in the real Mesopotamia. Time and wind have worn away the mud brick from which most ziggurats were made. Recent centuries have not been kind to them. Wars and climate changes and looting, too, have wrought their damage. But enough remains to tell a fascinating story, not only of the era in which this ziggurat was made, but also concerning all the subsequent rulers who tried to restore or reshape the building, including Saddam Hussein. Each tried to leave his stamp on the architecture. So what you see now is not exactly what was built in approximately 2100 BC. Let's look a little closer at the actual structure and see how it was made and what the story can tell us. The main building material of Mesopotamia was mud brick, not stone. Mud brick is a mixture of clay, which is found in abundance in this region, and straw usually. Clay mixed with chaff, straw, in order to temper it, helped hold its shape better. The clay was pressed into rectangular molds and left to dry in the burning sun. After drying, the clay was turned out of the molds and used as the building blocks of cities. The mud bricks were not always very permanent. Unbaked clay can be eroded by moisture and wind. If more permanence was desired, they would bake the bricks. So this is the primary material for the ziggurats. Mud bricks are still made today for dwellings in Iraq and elsewhere. It's called adobe in the New World, and we see its use in places that lack good sources of stone or wood, places like the desert of Iraq, the Moche Mounds or Huacas of northern Peru, and in ancient indigenous dwellings in the American Southwest. Some of the earliest examples of temple architecture in Mesopotamia can be found at the site of Uruk, which we know from our earlier lectures on the Uruk vase and head. They date from sometime around 3100 BC. The White Temple at Uruk is raised on a high terrace, about 13 meters high with a sloping side. It's made of mud brick, too. This structure, the White Temple, can be thought of as a proto-ziggurat. Indeed, the notion of a series of stepped terraces may have begun here at Uruk with these early examples. The sacred spaces were elevated above the plain. We know that sacred spaces often stay sacred for many generations, and it's believed that Mesopotamians usually built their temples on top of older and simpler versions. This was probably true of Ur, which was founded in the 4th millennium BC. The ziggurat built there is now the best preserved and most famous of this type of temple. The ziggurats were not standalone buildings. They were approached through a courtyard, and there were many structures in the vicinity of the ziggurat some of religious importance and some not. The ziggurat you see now was first built by a king named Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi around 2100 BC. Ur-Nammu ruled 2112 to 2095 BC and was the founder and most important king of the third dynasty of Ur, which was a Sumerian revival. After Ur had reached a pinnacle of influence around 2500 BC, a new force had taken over in Mesopotamia, the Akkadians. They were a Semitic-speaking people who created a new empire. We'll discuss their most important artwork in the next lecture. Then, the Akkadian Empire fell, and the kings of the ancient cities of Sumer went back to old ways and old forms of art. Ur-Nammu set about rebuilding the city of Ur, and the job was continued by his son, Shulgi. Ur-Nammu had his workmen create thousands of mud bricks, some fired but most not. The bricks were stamped with Ur-Nammu's name. The workmen built the lowest course of the temple into a rectangular platform that measured at the ground 62.5 by 43 meters, or 205 by 141 feet. It was 11 meters high, or 36 feet. This rectangular footprint was carefully oriented to the points of the compass. In fact, we even have an early cylinder seal which shows what appears to be a plan of a ziggurat with its careful orientation and its creation. This seal shows the planning that went into the building of a ziggurat. The second platform at Ur was half the height of the first and measured about 36 by 26 meters, 118 by 85 feet. The third platform, or terrace, has been lost to us, but it may have been about 2.9 meters high, 9.5 feet. A smaller shrine stood atop the third platform, but was destroyed. The entire structure was built from the mud bricks and then clothed in a coating of fired bricks laid carefully in waterproof bitumen or pitch. Holes pierced the inward sloping walls in order to allow water to evaporate from the solid core. Woolley, the excavator, referred to these as weeper holes. There were even 2 vertical drains for rainwater. The terraces have a niched or shallow buttressed facade, which is typical of Mesopotamian buildings, and it allowed this striking interplay of light and shadow in the harsh sun. There were also larger buttresses that lie on either side of its main staircase. The ziggurat builders sought another interesting effect. It foreshadows the Parthenon's slight adjustments via optical illusions by almost 2,000 years. The Sumerian architects made the 3 facades without stairways bulge and curve outwardly in the center. This sort of adjustment gave the building a feeling of more weight and solidity. When we look at the Parthenon, which dates to 447-438 BC, we see a very sophisticated use of a similar set of optical adjustments. This sort of outward bulge, or ground-hugging curvature of a platform, was used for the same sort of effect. The Greeks wanted to fool the eye, to make us feel the solidity and earthiness of the building. The ziggurat has 3 staircases, and each composed of 100 steps. The main staircase of the ziggurat leads straight up the front of the building and to a gatehouse, which covers it at the juncture with the side staircases, then continues to the top. This staircase may have been the one which priests used to gain access to the shrine at the top. It would have made a very impressive backdrop for ceremonial processions. If you look up from the ground level, it appears impressively steep and seems to go on forever. This type of staircase and its use by priests is something that we will see in the Maya world as well. The Maya, however, were lucky to have stone as a building material, and many of their pyramids are funerary temples. That is different from the purpose of the Mesopotamian ziggurat, but both represent mountains and union with the deities. Egyptian pyramids, by contrast, were solely funerary and were not meant to be climbed. They served as the tombs of the pharaoh and were faced in sheer stone. They functioned as much as a visual symbol of the king's divinity and connection with the sun as they did as a tomb. Going back to Ur, the two subsidiary stairways at the side of the temple meeting at the gate may have been used for priests or more domestic access too. Usually, Mesopotamian shrines had their access quite restricted, but after all, somebody had to carry food and goods up to the shrine at the top. The overall effect of the main facade with the three stairways was an impressive one. The stairways seemed to weave together at the gate and then funnel the people or the procession to the last stages of the temple tower. This sort of effect of appearing and disappearing staircases and people is also seen at the Mexican Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, which we'll discuss later in the course. Each terrace of the step tower at Ur was covered in baked brick and had a parapet, a small barrier wall at the edge. The workers placed a layer of reed matting between different courses of brick at regular intervals. You can see this more clearly at the site of Akarkuf, or the Kassite capital called Dur Kurigalzu, which has the ruins of a Kassite ziggurat. It dates to about 1400 BC, and though it's mostly destroyed, the layer of reeds can be seen thanks to the eroding winds. You can see that this Kassite ziggurat was also rather narrower and taller than the one at Ur. Its bottom terrace has been restored. The first terrace, or story, of the ziggurat at Ur dates to Ur-Nammu's time, around 2100 BC. It's thought that the second and third stories were extensively restored by the Babylonian king Nabonidus, 555 to 539 BC. Nabonidus was devoted to the moon god and revered these ancient shrines. Of course, through the thousands of years it has stood there, and even before Nabonidus' time, kings restored the building and may have altered it slightly in different ways. It's thought that Nabonidus may have used glazed brick, which is characteristic of Babylonian architecture, for the shrine. We'll see the Babylonian Ishtar Gate with its impressive use of color in glazed brick in a later lecture. Nabonidus was not the last person to restore the ziggurat. In fact, Saddam Hussein restored parts of the ziggurat here at Ur. This was his attempt to associate himself with the storied rulers of Iraq's glorious past. Ur-Nammu, the Neo-Sumerian king, was known for an ambitious program of architecture and built ziggurats and other religious architecture in many cities of southern Mesopotamia. It's this tradition which modern leaders like Saddam tried to emulate. The building of such temples was associated from the first with the religious duties of a king. Building temples showed he was pious, but it also served to emphasize his power through visual means. In fact, the building of temples was such an important part of the Mesopotamian rulers' tradition that kings were often shown in the arts as builders who humbly bear a basket of mud bricks on their heads. So, what was the temple shrine that stood on top of a ziggurat, this one or any other, usually used for? We don't know exactly, but we have a few clues. The shrine here could have been used as a bedchamber for the sacred marriage ritual. We have these words from Herodotus, writing about the famous ziggurat in Babylon named Etemenanki, or the Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth in 440 BC. On the summit, there is a spacious shrine, inside which there's an exceptionally large bed, richly decorated with a golden table beside it. No statue of any kind is erected there, and no one occupies the room at night except a single woman whom the god, so the priests say, has specially chosen for himself. They also say that the god comes to the room in person and sleeps on the bed. I do not believe it myself. Herodotus was not always the most accurate historian, but there's some truth to his account, according to other sources in literature of the time. Some accounts tell us that the sacred marriage ceremony was enacted on top of the ziggurat. This meant that the high priestess engaged in ritual marriage with the god, perhaps embodied in the person of the king. This ceremony of sexual union, which is incompletely understood, would have ensured the fertility and prosperity of the land. We just saw this theme of fertility and sacred marriage in the Uruk vase, where a king brings produce and gifts to Inanna, the fertility goddess. She's the deity most often associated with the sacred marriage ritual, and she unites with the vegetation god Dumuzi. We saw similar symbolism of this union and the duality of the sexes and flora and fauna in the gold goat or ram in a thicket from the cemetery at Ur. It's clear that the concerns of the Sumerian populace and down through time in this harsh land centered on sustenance and prosperity. The impulse of reaching toward heights, toward the divine, is something that seems to bridge many cultures. Egypt is credited with the original idea of the massive, smooth-sided pyramid. The sands and rock formations in the south of that country, into Sudan, sometimes form into a pyramidal shape due to wind erosion, and perhaps that inspired the idea. But the stepped temple tower of Mesopotamia seems to have been an early contemporary, if not forerunner, of the pyramid. You can compare the shape of a ziggurat with the early stepped pyramid of Saqqara in Egypt. The shape is similar to the radial pyramid of the Maya in Mexico and the famous stepped pyramid at Chichen Itza in Central America. The differences, however, are important. The Egyptian pyramids were used solely as funerary monuments and were not meant to be entered or climbed. The pyramid locked a royal tomb deep within, and the top was triangular and one with the building's body, which was based on a square. The ziggurat, in contrast, was usually rectangular at the base. It was meant to be climbed and was built with stairs to gain access to the shrine at the top. There, the ceremonies, such as the sacred marriage, would be enacted by rulers, priests, and priestesses. The stairways provided an impressive backdrop for a ceremonial procession. That kind of performance, or theater, also occurred at the Mexican pyramids of Teotihuacan and at Maya temples. Most of the American pyramids had shrines on top. Though they were built of stone, some also had tunnels for limited access to either a central burial or shrine in the interior. What all these man-made mountains had in common, however, was the desire to reach the skies and the divine in some manner. Whether sky god or constellation, fertility or weather divinity, all had some connection with the heavens and could be approached more closely from the height of that elevated shrine. The sacred space created by the pyramid or ziggurat could also be used to reinforce the ruler's legitimacy as a semi-divine figure in his own right. In the Mesopotamian ziggurat, the ruler most likely engaged in rituals on top of the temple and may have impersonated a god. He was also the force behind the building of these temples and was not afraid to proclaim this. Egyptian kings claimed to be or become divine upon death and merged with the god Osiris. The Egyptian pyramid could be seen according to some, as a resurrection machine, a structure which actually facilitated the king's rebirth. This was also true of the Maya temples that served as burials, such as that of Pakal, the ruler of Palenque. Pakal, whose elaborate temple of the inscriptions could be used as both temple to the gods and tomb for a king, was depicted as headed towards divine rebirth. And some of these pyramids, like the Maya El Castillo at Chichen Itza, were also markers of time. They were oriented to produce special lighting effects, like the serpent of sunlight, which appears on the equinoxes, and had 365 steps, which recall the solar year. So it seems that a pyramid or artificial mountain had a great many symbolic meanings and functioned as a monumental reminder of the power of the gods, the ruler, the state, and even the cosmos. Keeping that in mind, the next lecture will explore the role of a ruler in art. We'll look at how the ruler can create visual propaganda, which deifies him and aggrandizes his role as warrior, conqueror, and leader of an empire. So, on to Naram Sin of Akkad, creator of one of the first empires in the world.